Really excited to be joined by our next guest, Dr. John Abramson. He's written a book, Sickening: How Big Pharma Broke American Healthcare and How We Can Fix It. This is something where he appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience, and Krystal and I were absolutely stunned by how good of an episode it was. Really excited to read the book. Haven't had that chance yet, but we have Dr. Abramson here in order to break some of this down. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So let's go a little bit into the book. What are some of the top-line ways of which you were able to expose the way that Big Pharma has rigged and destroyed the American healthcare system? And this is absent of the vaccine conversation, although we will get into that as well.
Right. So I spent about after my first book came out, Overdosed America, lawyers started to call me to serve as an expert in litigation against the drug companies, plaintiffs' lawyers. And I spent about 10 years inside the corporate computers. We would get the corporate hard drives. There would be up to 20 million documents in each case. And over those 10 years, I learned what the drug companies are doing. I know what's going on. I know how they've taken over the knowledge that is created and delivered to doctors, and how they encourage, how they create the impression that doctors are practicing the best medicine for their patients by prescribing new and expensive drugs and consuming resources that would be better spent on social determinants of health and other approaches than giving expensive new drugs. I know how that happened. Mm-hmm. Some of it I can tell, and some of it remains sealed. But the bottom line is that American healthcare is performing horribly. Americans' healthy life expectancy, the number of years they live in good health, now ranks 68th in the world. It's gone down from 38th to 68th between 2000 and 2019. And for that awful health, we're spending an extra $1.5 trillion a year on our healthcare.
Wow.
This ought to be the biggest story. This is bigger than 9/11. There are more people. The excess death rate in the United States is like we're having a 9/11 every 2.25 days. Every single 2.25 days. 3 jumbo jets going down every day. And this story is not covered.
So what are the roots of that issue? Because, yeah, I mean, you look around the rest of the developed world, they're not seeing these spiking rates of diabetes deaths, of overdose deaths, these excess deaths that you're tracking closely. So what is the root cause of these issues?
Yeah, I think there are two causes, Krystal. I think one is that the production and dissemination of what doctors take as medical knowledge has been turned over to the commercial interests. So essentially the research agenda is set by commercial interests. They control the studies, they control the data, own the data, do the analyses, mostly prepare the manuscripts for publication. The peer reviewers, we physicians are taught to trust that peer-reviewed articles in medical journals are the gold standard, and we should determine our medical practice according to the peer-reviewed studies. What we're not taught is that the peer reviewers don't even get to look at the data for themselves. They have to accept what the drug companies largely the drug companies have sent them. So on the one hand, we've got the control of medical knowledge having been given over to the commercial interests without adequate oversight. And on the other hand, we have the dissemination to the public of that information, largely influenced by the drug companies because the enormous amount of advertising that they do.
Right. Yeah, this was the part that I was really stunned by during your episode, was about the specific data. So this is where we can involve the vaccine conversation. Doctor, how have you found it difficult to balance two things? Number one, the drug companies have rigged trials in the past, have not been honest, so much so that they've had to pay multi-billion-dollar fines, and the actual efficacy of a medicine. How do we, as laymen, How are we supposed to balance our mistrust, rightfully, with actual information? How do you look at that problem?
It's a huge problem, Saagar. And what we need to do is look at all the data and make our own decisions. In the case of the vaccinations, Pfizer is fighting with the FDA as its partner to slow walk the release of the data from its original large study of efficacy and safety of vaccines. And the FDA is making the claim that they should get 75 years to release the data from that study. It's craziness. It's craziness that the public doesn't get access to that data. Now, that would seem to support an anti-vaccine position, that we don't have the data, and if the data weren't hiding something, Pfizer would probably be more likely to volunteer it. On the other hand, there's real-world data, and we know that people who are unvaccinated have about 20 times the risk of dying of COVID, and there's no question that these vaccines are effective. And I would urge everybody to get vaccinated and get boosted when it's recommended. But we need to liberate the data. And it's just another example of how the pharmaceutical industry is controlling this game. I mean, what kind of market could you have when the consumers, the purchasers, the users aren't allowed to see the data upon which the claims that their product is useful and safe are being made? It makes no sense.
Could you just, so people can make this really concrete, walk through an example of, from the development of a drug to the trials that are performed to how it's presented to the FDA to how it's ultimately presented to doctors and then how it's prescribed to patients, how this all works and the way that process has been corrupted? I know you have some really specific examples in the book of how this has all gone down.
Yeah. So what happens is drug companies fund about 86% of clinical trials now. And almost all clinical trials are about drugs and devices. They're not about how to improve Americans' health in a more general way. So the drug companies fund the trials, and they hire companies called contract research organizations to do the research. Now, in 1991, academic medical centers did 80% of the research, and the academics could play a role in designing the studies and picking the outcomes and the doses and the populations that were in the study and analyzing the data and writing it up. In 1991, 80%. That dropped to 26% by 2004. So what happened is the drug companies took control of almost of 3/4 of the research. And because they could pull the rest of the research, they exerted influence over the academic medical centers for the 26% of the research they were getting. So they own the data. They do the analyses. They send in the manuscript. Generally, they play a role in writing the manuscript that gets sent to the journal for peer review. The peer reviewers look at it. They look for obvious mistakes, but they don't have the data. So it's assumed that when the article is peer reviewed, the peer reviewers have reanalyzed the data and make sure that the study is saying what the manuscript says. That doesn't happen. So the doctors read the peer-reviewed article in the medical journal thinking that they're doing what they're supposed to do, but it's not vetted. And they accept that as fact, and they start prescribing drugs based on that. And then those articles get collected up into clinical practice guidelines. But the experts who write the clinical practice guidelines that set the standards for medical care, they too don't get the data. They have to rely on the commercial analysis of the data that's published in the medical journals. So that information is what forms the basis of what's called evidence-based medicine that all doctors are supposed to practice to provide the best care to their patients. The doctors don't understand that information has not been verified. So that's how the standard is set. And that's we've got a tail wags dog situation. The pharmaceuticals spend about 17% of our total medical budget, so they're not spending all the money. But what they're doing is in teaching doctors how that money should be spent. And it should be spent on the products that they've decided to invest in as a research, in their research agenda, not because they'll produce the most health, but because they will produce the greatest financial return on investment. So that's our system. It's close to the system in other countries. The difference in the United States is we don't have guardrails that exist in other countries. Mm-hmm. So we don't have independent health technology assessment. We don't have an organization that looks at all the data and determines which therapies are most effective for patients. The FDA tells us which drugs we can prescribe, but the FDA does not tell us which drugs we should prescribe. And almost all the other countries have that. We don't have, and it would be easy. We were the first country to have health technology assessment, and it got scuttled with Newt Gingrich's contract with America in 1995. So now we were the first to have it, and now we're practically the only country not to have it.
Fascinating.
And similarly, we don't allow cost-effectiveness studies to be funded by federal money. We don't allow the cost of drugs to be included in the recommendations of therapy made by government-sponsored organizations. So what we've got in broad brushstrokes is the drug companies are controlling what doctors think they know about the best way to practice medicine, and we don't have the guardrails that other countries have.
So let's get into the how we can fix it part then. You have an exhaustive list, but give us some of the top line ways. What are some of the best ways we can fix our healthcare system?
Well, number one is peer review has to be real. This is ridiculous. We're now operating on scientific standards that predate the Enlightenment. We're back in the 1600s here. So peer reviewers have to have the data if they're going to allow their analysis to be used as saying that the study, the results of the study that are presented are actually true. So we've got to fix peer review. We need a national mechanism of health technology assessment, an independent agency or organization that gets all the data and that makes recommendations about which drugs are most effective. And I know you're interested in insulin. That's a big example. We are spending an extra $20 billion a year on insulin analogs, the latest iteration of bioengineered insulin for people with type 2 diabetes, and it's no better. We could reinvest that $20 billion in helping people at risk of diabetes to participate in active lifestyle counseling and healthy lifestyle activities in their communities, and we get a lot more health out of it than that. We need to control the price of drugs, not just because the drugs are too expensive. They are. We spend 3.5 times more. The price of brand name drugs in the United States is 3.5 times more than it is in other OECD countries. But that price funds the distortion of our healthcare. So the profit in the United States, 2/3 to 3/4 of global pharmaceutical profits come from the United States. All that money creates this huge machine that can lobby, that can hire PR, that pays doctors to be key opinion leaders. And that money itself distorts our healthcare system. So just doing those few things, having health technology assessment, having cost effectiveness research, controlling the price of drugs, and rebalancing our research agenda so that it reflects the health needs of the American people and not the financial wishes of the pharmaceutical industry, that would go a long way. And one other thing would help, which is when drug companies are found guilty of wrongdoing, they ought to be subjected to penalties that are commensurate with the crime, so that when people misrepresent science and reap profits in the billions of dollars range that are ill-gotten because their data hasn't been adequately represented, that's stealing $1 billion. And somebody steals $20, they get in trouble. But if you steal $1 billion, you're okay. Those simple measures would go a long way towards bringing American healthcare back towards the function of the other wealthy countries.
Yeah.
Last question for you, John. The media has tended to talk about vaccine hesitancy solely as like a personal responsibility story. Like these bad people are maybe listening to the wrong podcast or whatever, and so they're not protecting themselves and they're not protecting their communities by doing the right thing and getting the vaccine. What have you thought about those narratives, and how do you think that your research about the genuinely malign influence of Big Pharma has impacted the level of vaccine hesitancy that we have in this country?
Krystal, that's really an important issue. And in fact, Robert Kennedy's book, which I wouldn't endorse, I'm not giving it a shout out, he starts his book, and the introduction of his book starts with a quote from me about drug company information. I am not an anti-vaxxer, but the question that you ask is a really important one, because people are aware that they're not getting the real data. And now Pfizer and the FDA joining arms to prevent the release of the data from Pfizer's big study, that fuels anti-vax sentiments. It's like, how can you expect us to take a drug when we can't see the data? And that's a very legitimate point. And I want to make sure that your listeners understand that they deserve the data, and that the anti-vax folks who use that as to support their argument are not wrong. Mm-hmm. But the real world data shows that these drugs the vaccines do way more benefit than harm. And I would say that the drug companies not being forthright about their data does way more harm than benefit. And this ought to create a public outcry to liberate that vaccine data so people know what they're getting.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. Doc, the last thing is that we were all talking about this before the segment, but you, like we said, we heard you on the Joe Rogan Experience. Has it been frustrating that, for all the talk in the media of Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Robert McCullough, I distinctly remember during your episode of not only handling these issues with grace, talking about Big Pharma and the rot of the healthcare system, but also pushing back yourself on around booster shots, around vaccination, myocarditis. Could you speak to that element of censorship in our modern discourse, if you feel comfortable?
Yeah, absolutely. Joe was a perfect gentleman with me. I didn't say anything with him that I'm not saying with you, and perhaps I went further out on a limb in terms of being critical of the pharmaceutical industry. That's not getting press, and I think it's not fair to Joe. Now that said, we do have a problem as we're now in a real age of rapid transition about how people get their information. And for reasons that I don't completely understand, this anti-vax sentiment is primal almost. So that when people come on to the media and they make an anti-vax argument, for some reason, it has credence that it ought not to have. The information's not been verified. And we do need to come up with some way to have guardrails on the quality of information that gets out on the internet without censoring that information. We haven't worked that out. And I think Joe is kind of at the forefront of raising the question of how we deliver a wide spectrum of information and at the same time ensure that that information is responsible, that both sides of the argument are presented. And I think what Joe wrote, maybe there are excesses. Maybe he's used language that it should never be used. I don't defend that. But he sure allowed me and many other people to tell their story that is opposite to the Malones and McCullochs.
Right.
So how we oversee the public responsibility of bringing information to people is unclear. But I think Rogan's not getting quite the fair deal that he should get. He's brought a lot of good information too.
Thank you, sir.
Very
Appreciate
caricaturous view of him out there right now. Thank you so much, Doctor. Great to have your insights.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you both.
Thank you guys so much for watching. I mean, can't appreciate you all more. You know, we were
Truly.
consumed by all of this weekend, and every time I was just like, thank God the business is the way it is.
Yeah.
Because, you know, people, both of us, our public stance of defending Rogan, I see, you know, all sorts of accusations crawling out of the woodwork. And, you know, look, guys, you enable us to have the wherewithal to not care about any of that because we rely only upon you for our business, the core of it. We've expanded now. We added the Matt Stoller collaboration that dropped over the weekend. I was stunned by how many of you watched it. I love that. I mean, we're continuing to find people like him. We're going to be continue to grow. We've branched out. You know, our clips are now on Instagram, on TikTok, to my own chagrin. But, you know.
You have to exist in the society as it is.
You know, yes, I critique society and I exist in society. So what are we supposed to do for our Gen Z fan base? You can go and follow us there, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, all of that. But you guys, premium subscriptions at the end of the day are the people who fund us, who enable us to bring you both the Stollers of the world, the Abramsons, and to just take the stands that we feel genuinely 100%. You will always know that that's where we're coming from, not from any other influence. So thank you all, and we really appreciate you.
Love you guys so much, and we will see you back here tomorrow. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.